I think we might as well go ahead and get started. If you're still eating, you can feel free to keep on eating. If you want to leave your plates where you are, leave them where they are. If you want to quickly put them up to get cleaned, that's fine as well. Wherever you are in the eating process is perfectly fine. Keep on doing what you're doing. I would like to get started, though. I'm mindful of the time. Welcome. Thank you for joining us for this Thursday Night Out speaker series. My name is Nicholas Cassis, and I am an associate rector here at Trinity-by-the-Cove. Tonight, we are honored to be joined by Francis Clooney, who is a Roman Catholic priest and a member of the Society of Jesus now for 55 years. But that's not even his day job. Father Clooney serves as the Parkman Professor of Divinity and Professor of Comparative Theology at Harvard Divinity School. He also taught for 21 years at Boston College. Father Clooney is a leading figure globally in the contemporary field of comparative theology. In this talk, he will reflect on his 50 years of learning from Hindu traditions as a Catholic priest and a Jesuit, and on how we balance a deep commitment to our own tradition while yet learning fearlessly from other faiths. We are so very thankful that he has agreed to be with us tonight. And a big thank you to Bruce McEver, who arranged for Father Clooney to be with us. Before we get started, just a few quick comments on the format. We will be recording this talk. It's actually being live streamed now, and it'll be on our website after the event if you want to go back to it and listen to it again, or if you know anyone who wasn't here who would benefit from listening to it. If you have questions, hopefully you saved a napkin or something. You could just jot them down as the presentation is going on, and we'll have a little time at the end for Q&A. I'll have a microphone, a handheld mic, and I'll be running that around to make sure that everyone can hear you, both online and Father Clooney as well. And now, without further ado, let me introduce Bruce McEver to introduce our speaker.
Uh-oh. We good? Thank you. Thank you, Nicholas. Well, it's a real treat. We have a real treat this evening, as some of you know who were at the Linton Quiet Day yesterday and listened to Father Clooney speak. He's a friend and a former teacher, and a very compassionate human being. I've experienced that. I was a part-time student at Harvard Divinity School, and part-time students don't get a room or anything. You sort of have to go find a place to live. You're sort of homeless. And Francis took me in at the Center for the Study of World Religions, and I will never forget that. It's a remarkable community, and I was privileged to be there. Nicholas has given you some of the background. You've seen his resume. He got his doctorate in South Asian languages and civilizations at the University of Chicago. And he has a real love for Christianity and India and Hinduism, and particularly the ancient text of that civilization. And he's in the process of writing a memoir about that passion, and I'm very much looking forward to reading that when it gets out. I took the course that I took with Francis. He was also very compassionate in that he waived the requirement for reading Sanskrit in order to get into that class, and so I'm eternally grateful. He's a real expert in these texts, in these ancient texts, which I don't know about some of you, but they're very mystic and very interesting. He's written, in fact, 15 books on this subject. He's collected 2 volumes of essays and translations, and I asked him which of the books we should read, and so you might want to take these down. These are the ones that we're trying to sell. We don't have any in the back for you tonight. But what Francis recommended was Hindu Wisdom for God's Children. It was published in 1998, and Learning Interreligiously. Before I sit down and we listen to Francis, I want to tell one more tale about him. When I was at the center, I used to love to go to his office, and it's really quite an amazing place with these great books and everything. And we were talking about the Buddha and why Buddhism wasn't more prevalent in India and how it left. And he pulls out this leaf, and he says, "Do you know what this is?" And I said, "No." He said, "This is a leaf from the tree that the Buddha was realized under, or it's a clone from that tree." And I went, "Oh my God." I took that leaf, and I have it in my library, someplace in Connecticut, in one of my books. And one of these days, I'm going to find that leaf. But anyway, Francis is going to enlighten us, and I'm really looking forward to it. Thank you.
Can you hear me now? Is it good enough? Okay. And it was a last-minute decision to have the visual at all. These are really my notes for myself, but I will try as we go along to make them as hard to read as possible. That's about as big as I can make them, but it wasn't meant to be a visual for you. It was more like my notes for myself. So if you can see them, but if you can't see them, don't worry about it too much. So I'm grateful to be here. I'm grateful for the parish inviting me. Father Nicholas has been a wonderful host, and Bruce has been a great host and friend, making it possible for me to be here with you. I certainly enjoyed yesterday's event and was honored to be able to be with you to go through some of those beautiful scenes from the Gospel according to John. And this is part of who I am too. So yesterday I think I was fairly studious in not talking about India or Hinduism. And yet that has been part of my life longer than I've been ordained a priest. 50 years ago this summer, I went to Nepal from New York. I was a New Yorker, grew up there. After college at Fordham University, I got on a plane in that summer despite my mother's protests and took Pan Am 1 around the world. In those days, you couldn't just fly to India as you can now. So I went from New York to London, Paris, Rome, Beirut, Karachi, Delhi, missed the connection to Kathmandu, stayed overnight, and then got to Kathmandu on July 7 in 1973. And what I'd like to really share with you is what that was all about. I'll begin in Kathmandu, and then I'll back up a bit to talk about who I was before I got there. But Kathmandu, 1973, the capital of Nepal, a kind of Shangri-La, one of the few Asian countries that was not the colony of some European power. The benefit of that was the autonomy and the dignity of the tradition and the people. But the other aspect was that it was fairly unconnected to the outside world. When I got there, there was a tiny airport strip for planes to land. Only a few years before, there were no roads down to India from Kathmandu, which is about 5,000 feet up in the foothills of the Himalayas. So a fairly austere culture, beautiful mix of Hindu and Buddhist. In those days, the ruler of the country was a monarch, King Birendra, a young king who had taken over when his father died just a year or so before I got there. So it was kind of exotic place to be in 1973. Much change has come to the country. We could talk about that later if we have time. But getting there in 1973, this beautiful city, it was a scene for me so important to begin with, living Hinduism and living Buddhism. The majority of the people in the country are Hindu, but the majority of the people in the country live south down near the Indian border. So the Kathmandu Valley, which is really the heartland, the capital, the old monarchy and so on, is probably more Buddhist than Hindu. And because of the revolution in China and the persecution of the people of Tibet, the Dalai Lama and others fled over the mountains down into India and Nepal, and there were a number of settlements of Buddhist monks also from Tibet in Kathmandu and in some of the outlying hills. So before I had studied anything of Hinduism as a scholar, before I had really done any serious reading, I was suddenly there in Kathmandu in 1973, and finding myself there, as I say, in the midst of living Hinduism and Buddhism, and teaching at a Jesuit school. So I had entered the Society of Jesus in 1968, right after high school. That's what we did in those days. I was just a few days 18 when I entered the order. Seems very young now, but then it was sort of commonplace that we would do that. So I came to Kathmandu right after graduating from Fordham University, and suddenly a few days later found myself in the classroom teaching English language subjects mainly. You know, reading, speech, pronunciation, spelling, all these things. The one thing I had going for me was a native English speaker, despite it being American English, but nonetheless I was a native speaker. And I was there teaching them, and it was an existential experience that I was 22, and these boys I was teaching were 14, 15, 16, 17, maybe not that much younger than me. And yet they were all Hindu and Buddhist, and for the first time in my life, I was immersed in a culture where the vast majority of people were not Christian. I grew up in New York City, which is a very diverse place, of course, and certainly was 50, 60 years ago. But in terms of the intensity of a place where there were very few Christians in the country, and everybody was Hindu and Buddhist from the king on down, it was an incredible experience to be in that context with these boys. It was a boarding school, so I spent my spare time, I didn't have spare time actually, I ran study halls. I even, being one of the most unathletic people you can meet, I refereed games running up and down the soccer field, the football field, took the kids on trips to downtown, to the zoo, and very importantly for me, to different Hindu festivals. Over at the great temple of Pashupati, the god Shiva, the festivals in the night, the festivals by the river. So I was definitely immersed in the culture and getting very involved in the context of that country. One of the things I was able to do also was begin to get outside the city and travel out in the hills. And so I'll back up and show you one picture. I added the pictures between evening prayer and dinner, so this is not very professional. But this, first of all, proves I'm the guy in the middle, in case you had any doubts. And that it proves that I once was young. I definitely was younger in that picture than I am now. But to go out in the hills, these were two of the workers from the school, most gracious, most hospitable, took me out on a trip in the hills, just going to their villages, spending some days with them where they came from. And it was so exciting to be in the midst of the culture and to be among the people, learning Hinduism again existentially by being there rather than thinking about it conceptually or abstractly. But then what I did, this should switch to the next one. Okay. I had to teach a course called Moral Science, and this was part of the arrangement between the Jesuits and the King of Nepal, that the Jesuits would not proselytize, would not try to convert the boys, but could teach moral principles and then teach anything else we wanted to teach. And so there was a course called Moral Science in which we were to teach moral principles, basically do not steal, do not lie, do not kill, respect for marriage, and so on like that. But I found that, for me at 22 and the boys in their teens, rather boring. So I started bringing into the classroom Hindu texts such as the Bhagavad Gita. And to be in the classroom with the boys, reading really for the first time this wonderful masterpiece text, the teaching of the Lord Krishna to the warrior Arjuna, something like the epic of the Iliad. But the meaning of life, the path of life, detached action in the world, to be testing it and trying out in the classroom with students was so exciting, particularly when all the boys were Hindu and Buddhist. That was an eye-opening experience for me. And as I was saying at dinner, the Bhagavad Gita is a text you can live with all your life, because I think there are wise teachings in that are not the same as the Bible and not the same as the New Testament, but nonetheless are harmonious. And you can ask questions about this later, about Krishna and Christ and so on, if you would like. But I remember one evening in a study hall that after having this experience, I also found my first favorite text of Hinduism, Rabindranath Tagore, was a leading Indian dramatist, playwright, novelist in the early 20th century. He died around 1950, I think. And the first non-European to win the Nobel Prize for Literature. And he won it for this little book called Gitanjali, which is like a garland of songs. And in this book, this is the first song. I remember sitting in a study hall. I grabbed a book just to be there and to read something while I was watching the boys to make sure they were doing their homework. And I came across this hymn which opened the door for me and said, yes, I can connect with Hinduism. Thou hast made me endless, such is thy pleasure. This frail vessel thou emptiest again and again, and fillest it ever with fresh life. This little flute of a reed thou hast carried over hills and dales, and hast breathed through it melodies eternally new. At the immortal touch of thy hands, my little heart loses its limits in joy, and gives birth to utterance ineffable. Thy infinite gifts come to me only on these very small hands of mine. Ages passed, and still thou pourest, and still there is room to fill. And it goes on for about 100 songs like this. And for me, it was kind of a confirmation that Hinduism needn't be a foreign religion somewhere else, that my life would be spent thinking about it conceptually, how can I connect to this? But the immediacy of this poetry by a Hindu scholar, Hindu poet, somehow meant to me that we can connect. And I think much of my life in the last 50 years has been about this kind of connection. Background. When I got to Kathmandu and found myself beginning to fall in love with the culture, the text, going to the temples, going to the festivals, it was kind of improbable because Irish Catholic New York, grew up in Staten Island, born in Brooklyn, grew up in Staten Island, New York, went to the grammar school in the parish, taught by the nuns, first grade through 8th grade, then went to Regis High School, a Jesuit high school in Manhattan. And there was absolutely nothing in my background or experience that would have said, when I graduated from high school in 1968, that 5 years later, I would be in Kathmandu and having a wonderful time. And I think part of the story of my vocation is how I began to be the kind of person who could be open interreligiously while remaining 55 years later still a Jesuit, 45 years later still a priest. And I think it had something to do with, paradoxically, and I hope you agree with this, or at least we can talk about it, growing up Catholic in a staunchly Catholic environment, the nuns and the priest, the old Mass. I'm old enough that I learned the Latin prayers as an altar boy, and then young enough that after a year the pastor said, okay, you can forget the Latin now, we're going to do it in English from now on. But having that background and the old rituals like benediction, that somehow this kind of rich ritual tradition, the Latin, the bells, the incense, the flowers, all of these things were so sacramental and so kind of a sense of the sacred in the material that when I got to Kathmandu, I said, yes, this is very similar. And I wasn't at a loss because it seemed to resonate with me and ring bells. Sacramentality and piety, but also certainly in my Catholic tradition, I'm sure in your traditions too, a strong intellectual element. That the piety of the Catholic community in which I grew up, and certainly my Jesuit high school, were not hesitant to embrace the intellectual life, and were not afraid of knowing or learning or finding out things that we didn't understand. I think that's been a hallmark of my life too. Don't tell me what I already know, but rather open me to what I don't know, and we can see where that leads us. So I began to explore and to think, even as a boy in high school, even when I got to college at Fordham University, studying philosophy as part of the Jesuit course. When I was doing these things and learning in this way, I had a disposition, I think, of mind and heart that whatever is true, whatever is beautiful, I can reach out to that, even if it's across religious boundaries. There's no rule saying that Christians can only learn from Christians, Catholics only from Catholics, but rather the openness of the mind doesn't respect such boundaries. Two of the passages that for me were very decisive growing up in the 60s, Vatican II was the big change in the church in that time period, I'm sure you all remember. But in Nostra Aetate, a document that was kind of came in, a declaration at the end of the council, put before me kind of this Magna Carta, this charter of religious openness. The Catholic Church rejects none of the things that are true and holy in these religions. She regards with sincere attentiveness those ways of conduct in life, precepts and teachings, which though differing in many ways from the one she holds and sets forth, nonetheless by no means rarely reflect a ray of the truth which enlightens all people. And this for me was kind of opening the door, because it said, whatever is true and holy in these religions, conduct, ways of life, precepts and teachings, the church honors those. But the catch, of course, is you can't honor them if you actually don't know what they are. So it sort of gave permission to somebody like me to say, I will learn from Hinduism, I will learn what's true and holy, I will see it, I will be there, and then I will, in the way that Catholics do, I'm sure your church as well, we find ways to honor and respect the truth wherever it is. Or even older, one of my other favorite passages which didn't make it into Vatican II, Philippians. Paul in chapter 4 of Philippians. Finally, beloved, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is pleasing, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. And it seemed to me there, you can find other passages in St. Paul that might counter and say the folly of the cross, the stumbling block to Jews and Gentiles, and so on. But it seemed to me this passage, the true, the honorable, the just, the pure, the pleasing, the commendable, if you find it somewhere new, if you find it among people that you didn't think you would find it among, think on these things. Contemplate them, meditate on them. So I think these dispositions were in me, even though I knew nothing about Hinduism, even though I wasn't really ready to go to Nepal in 1973, nonetheless the door was opened to a deeper learning. I was also part of a great humanist tradition, the Catholic tradition, like the Anglican tradition that many of you belong to, that we honor the mind, we honor learning, we honor the great tradition of the Middle Ages. And part of my Jesuit training, takes 10 years from entering the order to ordination, was to study a lot of philosophy and later a lot of theology. And I think, again, it was the sense that we can learn from the great thinkers, the Greeks, Plato and Aristotle, the pre-Socratics, other great Greek thinkers, but also from Virgil and Cicero, great thinkers of the Roman world. We can listen to them and learn from them, even if they are not Christian, even if they are other traditions or simply philosophers. That was kind of drilled into us again and again. Wherever there is truth with a capital T. And truth with a capital T is the truth of Christ. And so we find this in different places. I also loved language and literature, which explains in many ways, as Bruce was saying, I went on to study a lot of Indian texts and Sanskrit language, Tamil language of South India. I already loved to read. I mean, one of the things I learned as a child was to always be reading a book. Reading a novel. I still do this all the time. I have actually 3 novels with me on this trip, just in case I run out. But I'm always reading. And I think, as a kid in high school, reading Dostoevsky for the first time, Crime and Punishment, the Brothers Karamazov, opening my mind to learning. I did a full year course as a senior, just months before I went off to Kathmandu, in Shakespeare. The dramas, the tragedies, the comedies. Learning from literature is a beautiful thing. And if we can learn from literature, then there's really no end to our learning. Faith buttressed by philosophy, buttressed by literature, not faith opposed to what we learn, wherever we may learn it. And I think all of that helped me as a young person to begin to understand the new reality that I sort of went into when I got to be in Kathmandu. A note on why did I go there? We had a conference in 1971, so my 3rd year in the society. We had a conference up at Lemoyne College in Syracuse on the International Apostolate of the Society of Jesus. And the speaker, who was a very senior Jesuit from the Philippines, Father Horatio de la Costa, he said, you have to understand, looking at young people like me, you enter not New York province, not Philippines province, not this place or that place, you enter a global society. And you become a Jesuit, you enter an organization that can take you anywhere in the world. And I thought to myself, here I am destined, because I know Greek and Latin, to go back and teach at Regis High School in Manhattan or Canisius High School in Buffalo or something like that. Why don't I do something wildly different and go somewhere else and test what Father was saying about the global? So I looked around, I looked at the Philippines, I looked at Caroline Islands, Ecuador for some reason, Nigeria, where New York had a new mission. And I had this great instinct that I wanted to go to India. And I have Indian friends, Hindu friends, who say, well, that's because you were a Hindu in a previous life. And I say, I can't speak to that because we don't believe in rebirth. But nonetheless, they say, well, there's some reason why India jumped out at me. And I think, I always told myself at the time, it had to do with the fact that I admired Mother Teresa and Gandhi, these two great figures who were dominant figures on the scene of India in that time period. She was still alive, of course, and he had died, had been assassinated. But somehow attracted there and saying, let's take this leap, let's go from Fordham University, graduating from college, to the other side of the world, totally unprepared, and let's see what happens. And my argument, I guess, to myself at least, is 50 years later, it still works. That crossing the boundaries has enabled me to be a Catholic priest, to be a Jesuit, to go to a parish on Sundays, to teach at Harvard during the week, and study Hinduism all the time. And somehow the mystery of this is still a mystery, but I think it does work. After I was ordained a priest in 1978, and I'll go fast on this because I do want to leave time for questions, I had this great formation as a Jesuit. Philosophy study, after I came back from Kathmandu, theology study, the classics of Catholic tradition, Christian tradition, I should say, biblical studies, church history, Vatican II, and so on and so on. After I was ordained, I persuaded the priest in charge in New York, who wanted me to go to Germany to study theology, saying, look, you're smart, you're a Jesuit, you should go and study with German theologians. I said, I don't want to do that kind of theology. I want to be a theologian who learns from other religions, which was kind of surprising. Even then, it was not a common thing. And to be able to say, not to study with Karl Rahner or Johannes Metz or Hans Urs von Balthasar, these great figures on the German-speaking scene, but rather say, I want to learn Hinduism. So I persuaded them, and God bless the provincial superior for letting me do it, to go, as Bruce said, University of Chicago, not the Divinity School, but the Department of Indian Studies, South Asian Languages and Civilizations, build on my Latin and Greek by learning Sanskrit, which is in the same family of languages, you may know, Tamil, a South Indian language, and beginning to read, as I had been reading in my Christian tradition, reading the mystical text called the Upanishads, reading, as I mentioned already, the Bhagavad Gita, doing ritual studies, like studying liturgical theology, but studying Hindu liturgical theology, and on and on. I began to have this kind of sense of another formation, where the other part of me was learning also to be educated interreligiously as well. Here I am. Again, this is all to document that I keep getting older over time. This is in around 1990. I was back in South India studying with a number of teachers. This is Sri Sampat Kumar, who was very generous and took me in to teach me Hindu devotional poetry. And for a year, I'd cycle over to his house. It was not so dangerous to cycle in Madras or Chennai in those days. I'd cycle over to his house, and we'd open up the big dusty books, reading Tamil and Sanskrit together, and I'd be asking him all kinds of difficult questions, trying to trip him up, and he would always be able to answer me. And so we became good friends, and it was just a wonderful experience. As I had studied with Jesuit teachers, Jesuit scholars, now to be studying with Hindu teachers, and I could name 5 others for you. I learned with him and to read not just the Upanishads and the Sanskrit tradition, but to pick up mystical poetry from the Tamil tradition, a local language in South India, which is now still the first language of about 80, 90 million people. So it's not a tiny language, it's a big language. But this poetry also spoke to my heart, as I hit my heart. These saints of South India called the Alvars, which probably means something like those who are immersed in God, plunged into the reality of God. And these are 2 verses that stood out to me around 1980 when I first read them. Whichever form pleases his people, that is God's form. Whichever name pleases his people, that is his name. Whichever color pleases his people, who contemplate him unwearying, that is his color, he who holds the discus. So God will come to us in the form, the shape, the face, the color, carrying whatever, as we expect. That God is infinitely patient with the human race and comes to us in the forms we understand. And while it's not the same thing as the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, from John, there's a sense of God accommodating us, that God comes in our form, God speaks our language, God dwells among us. As we saw yesterday, come and see, come and stay with Jesus and see. This verse, I think, was saying something of the same. Or another one, a more mystical verse even. Today and tomorrow and a little longer still, your grace, O Lord, is all I've got. Surely without you I am not. But see, O Lord Narayana, without me you are not. And this mutual dependence. I don't know if the commentators don't think he literally means that if he disappeared, then God would disappear, who's called Narayana here. But rather the sense of the intimate connection that the Lord and the servant, God and the created being are so intimately connected that God wouldn't know what to do as God if we did not exist. And I think, again, this poetry, like reading Tagore, spoke to my heart and opened things up for me. But what I try to point out is why I have there that one line at the bottom there, a whole formation alongside my first, a double learning. And so I think, again, the metaphor is like Sundays I go to the parish, weekdays I teach at Harvard, I read and preach on the readings of the day on Sunday, I read Hindu classics on Tuesday and Thursday. That this back and forth process is sort of in my DNA at this point. It's built into who I am. But I think it would be better if I hadn't done that. We can talk about that in a few minutes when I stop talking. What does it mean to sort of be able to cross back and forth? And some of you may raise your hand and say, well, I've been doing this for 50 years too, so I know what you're talking about. And it doesn't have to be Hindu Catholic. It could be Jewish Catholic, Jewish Christian. And Catholic, I keep using Catholic here, but I mean it in an inclusive sense. So I'm not just talking about Roman Catholics, but rather Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Christian, Buddhist, Christian, and so on. Where are the ways in which we relate to people, other traditions other than our own? Or in today's world, young people who are spiritual but not religious, people who are humanists and no longer identify. Can we somehow learn from them? I think is the challenge, and I think we can, but then you have to have roots in your own faith and you have to be open to the other as well. Here's another picture. Around 1993, there was a new temple built in Madras right on the ocean, the temple of the 8 Lakshmis. Lakshmi is a great Hindu goddess, and there are 8 forms of Lakshmi. Like if you go to the National Shrine, the Catholic Shrine in Washington, all those altars of the Virgin Mary in the basement, this shrine had 8 Lakshmis, 8 forms of the same goddess. And I got to know these young priests in those days. And so when I was getting ready to leave, they insisted on having a picture. And I just stress that this too is so important. I unfortunately have not kept in touch with them over the years. But the idea that interreligious learning is intellectual, it is meditative, it is contemplative, and it's all about friendships too. Having friends in other religious traditions can do wonders for you. And the fact that these young men didn't run the other way when I came by and said, here's the white man, here's the Gentile, here's the outsider. But they took me in, literally by the hand sometimes, and showed me around inside the inner sanctum of the temple and so on, I think was so important for me. So I did all that, and I think I'll go a little bit quicker now, that this has been my life, this openness, this instinct to openness, the Vatican II context. If I was 20 years older, I might have been like slapped down by Pius XII or Pius XI. No, you can't do that kind of learning. But in my time and place, it was possible to live this out as a life. So from then on, and then I'll go quickly and then we can talk. I finished my doctorate at University of Chicago in 1984, and then very, very fortunate to get a teaching position at Boston College in the theology department, which then was growing and by leaps and bounds and becoming a national university. The sign that it was really doing well wasn't really religious except for some alumni. Doug Flutie, some of you may remember the name Doug Flutie, who beat Miami, that Hail Mary pass. Nonetheless, was my first year there was Doug Flutie's senior year. So the Hail Mary pass, winning the Heisman Trophy, winning the Cotton Bowl. And I sort of innocently said to people, does BC do this every year? That sounds pretty good, a very good team here. But it was a perfect time to come to BC. It was growing and it was prosperous and it was Catholic with a large C and a small c. And they basically let me teach as I needed to teach, to experiment with courses like Gods and Goddesses of India, Holy Men and Women of India. Later I taught a course which became a book, Hindu Goddesses and the Virgin Mary, God, Hindu, and Christian. And BC, that kind of Jesuit intellectual context, gave me the space to experiment and to learn with my students interreligiously. And I really was thinking, I have it in the screen here, preaching, teaching, and writing. And for me, they're definitely not the same thing, preaching, teaching, and writing. But they have the same dynamic, is that the point is not to, there can be a giving of information, there should be. But the main thing is to create context in which the people you're talking to can open their minds and to learn anew. And I try to do this in my preaching, always working with the readings of the Sunday. I don't go off on a theme of some sort, but try to stick close with the reading no matter how puzzling it is. Opening a pathway and sort of begging the congregation by the end of Mass, please, when you go home, open up your New Testament and read chapter 4 of John, which we'll have this coming Sunday, or chapter 9 of John the next Sunday, or read this psalm over again, or read the beautiful passage we heard at evening prayer from Wisdom. You do it yourself, that these texts are alive and they're for you. Those of you who were yesterday morning, I wasn't preaching to you yesterday morning, but nonetheless, the same idea that the Gospel of John comes alive if you're able to take it. And I think in my preaching I do that, but I think in my teaching too, that part of my teaching at BC and then since 2005 at Harvard is again informational. We have responsibilities to help people, training for master's degrees, MDiv degree, doctoral degree. We have to make sure that they know their Sanskrit and Tamil. Everybody except Bruce got the Sanskrit. No, I'm joking. Most of them don't get the Sanskrit. But responsibilities as teachers. But what I'm trying to do, because many of the students I teach are not going to go on in Hindu Christian studies of some sort, but don't you realize you can take 1,000-year-old, 2,000-year-old text from another tradition other than your own, and if you spend time with it in a decent translation, it begins to speak to you. And I think what I found teaching at BC and teaching courses like the ones on the screen at the bottom of the page is that just as I find ways to open up the Gospel of John, let's say for you yesterday, or just the way I on Sunday try to open up the reading of the day, teaching in the classroom and trying to open up like Hindu mystical poetry or Tagore's Gitanjali or the Bhagavad Gita isn't simply saying, oh, that is scripture for them. And it's not saying, well, their scripture equals our scripture, it's all the same. But rather, you teach it in a way that it's opening up and raising questions and giving life possibilities to the people who read it. And I think that's, I see as my main job as a teacher, is to enable students to learn on their own terms, at least in the 21st century. I have these courses I teach at Harvard here at the bottom, Who Needs God? A course about the problem of God in American culture. Pew surveys about the decline in belief in God. One amazing statistic that even 20% of those who say they're Christian don't believe in the God of the Bible. Maybe you can explain that to me later. What do they believe in? But then going back to Hindu and Catholic Christian classics and going back and forth, how have people from the time of the book of Genesis or the Rig Veda understood a need for the divine? All the way up to the Middle Ages, St. Bonaventure in the Christian tradition, a goddess text in the Hindu tradition, Ramakrishna, the great Hindu mystic in the 19th century with Therese of Lisieux, the so-called Little Flower, two mystics who are kind of off the deep end, both of them in their own way, kind of odd people. But nonetheless, bringing it to life for Harvard students is quite a pleasure. And then Dorothy Day and Mahatma Gandhi. And it works because students are open to this. Each text throws you off balance because you look at it with the other and they don't quite fit together, but it makes you think about them. And then the last one I'll mention there, I'll skip because of time, Introduction to Hindu Spiritual Care. Now you may be thinking we Jesuits think we can do anything, but can we teach a course on Hindu ministry or Hindu spiritual care? The short answer is no. 50 years of teaching Hinduism doesn't make me a Hindu pastor or a Hindu ministry teacher. But I happen to have in Boston, the Ramakrishna Swami in Boston, Swami Tyagananda, an old friend of mine for 30 plus years. We team taught this course twice now, that as there is in our MDiv program, Introduction to Christian Ministry, there's actually Introduction to Buddhist Ministry. Then how do you open up questions in the Hindu scriptures, Hindu views of life, that then are applicable in hospital chaplaincy, campus ministry, prison ministry, hospice care, and so on like that. And this time in the fall, we had like 16 students. It was quite wonderful. But I think it's pushing the boundaries of how far I can go to be a Catholic priest Jesuit teaching Hindu ministry which I wouldn't do alone, but I would do it with a good friend who's a Hindu Swami. And to conclude, I'm almost done. Bruce has already mentioned my writings, but these are books that kind of cross the boundaries interreligiously. I'll just say something about the first one. I've mentioned this already. I taught a course, Divine Mother, Blessed Mother, Hindu Goddesses, and the Virgin Mary. And I think the point of this book, I had done an earlier book called Hindu God, Christian God. And then in this book, I said, well, one thing we in Christian West or Jewish tradition or Islam don't have are strong goddess figures. In fact, the goddess figures in the Hebrew Bible are often, cut down and destroyed. So what can we learn from a culture and a tradition that has thousands of years of goddess worship? Thousands of years of learning from goddesses, the hymns, the rituals, the imagery, and so on like that. And trying in the book to put before 3 vivid examples of 3 different Hindu goddesses through the poetry. And then saying, okay, we're Christian, we don't worship goddesses. You can't just add Hindu goddesses to Christian faith. But we can rethink, what is the Virgin Mary? Who is the Virgin Mary for our churches? And the way in which some traditions are skeptical, saying, why do they give so much honor to the Virgin Mary? But we do, and she's not a goddess, but somehow she fills the mother function. And I think I found for myself and for my students, seeing the goddesses and seeing Mary in relationship to one another opens up the possibility, not just for interreligious dialogue in general, Hindu-Christian dialogue in general, but rethinking the devotion to the Virgin Mary after knowing something about Hindu goddesses. And to conclude, I think, there's another picture. This was at a Hindu temple about 4 years ago with 4, the gentleman in the middle is head of a Hindu organization in Madras. He's a good friend of mine, T.K. Parthasarathi. Then the woman on the left, as you see it, she is a scholar, a Sanskrit scholar, head of a research institute herself. In between is a young professor from the United States, a Hindu professor. And then a gentleman next to me there on the screen is a devout Hindu who is also committed to interreligious learning. So we went out to a great Hindu temple connected with the teacher Ramanuja in about 2017. To conclude, I'll stop with this, that you don't have to be a professor to do this. The Catholic Church after Vatican II said dialogue is not simply about theological learning, but dialogue in life, having friendships, having neighbors of other faith traditions, people you meet in school or at work, at the hospital, whatever, that can be dialogue. Or people that you cooperate in action about the environment, or about safety on the streets, or about the quality of the schools, or in political engagement. All kinds of ways of dialoguing on issues of common concern that are not Hindu issues or Catholic issues or Muslim issues and so on. Spiritual exchange, meditation groups. I mean, many of you, some of you at least probably do yoga or Zen. And there can be ways in which people who can't talk about religious differences can meditate together following Zen practice, yoga practice, Taizé chant in the Christian tradition, or contemplative prayer, centering prayer, let's say, in Christian Catholic tradition. There can be ways of meditating together that don't avoid the intellectual issues, but don't start with the intellectual issues. And then you have study, people like me. But anybody can pick up a book and read it in a good translation. And I close by one last quote, Pope John Paul II, so Saint John Paul II. He gave a speech in India in 1986. And in giving this speech, he, who was no great liberal, as you may recall, tried to kind of get at the essence of what interreligious dialogue is about, talking to a largely Hindu audience. The fruit of dialogue is union between people and union of people with God, who is the source and revealer of all truth, whose spirit guides men and women in freedom only when they meet one another in honesty and love. By dialogue, we let God be present in our midst, for as we open ourselves in dialogue to one another, we open ourselves also to God. And I think this is incredibly important, the part I italicized, obviously the most important part, but that God wants the human race to be in dialogue. God wants people to be talking to one another across religious differences. And when we dialogue with one another, we're finding a new way for God to be present in our midst. Opening ourselves in dialogue, Hindu, Catholic, Hindu, Buddhist, Catholic, Muslim, and so on, is opening ourselves to God. And that's an infinite possibility. How can you be enough open to God? You can never be enough open. There can never be enough dialogue. So with that thought, I'll leave him on the screen there. I'll stop there and open it for discussion. But thank you for listening.
Thank you so very much. That was wonderful, wonderfully insightful, but also just a wonderful glimpse into your life and ministry these past 50 plus years. I'm sure you have questions for Father Clooney.
It's not so much a question. Well, I guess it is. In Peru, the Catholic Church allowed tolerances. Are you familiar with that?
Tolerances?
Tolerances.
Tell me.
So the Virgin is represented in churches dressed with moons and suns on,
yes, okay.
and related to the Pachamama,
Yes, okay, I do know, yes.
Earth Mother.
Yeah.
And so there's a coming together in Peru of the religion there that was essentially worshiping the moon and the sun, and the Catholic Church. And I think it's vital, although it's interesting, Peruvians will go to a sun or a moon temple for a wedding before they go into the Catholic Church to be married in front of God. So it works. Mm-hmm. And I just, my comment is, I'm in awe. Having spent time in India myself, it's just, it's a wonderful thing. And I'm glad that you have a counterpart from the Hindu faith that allows a rich dialogue.
Yeah.
Thank you
so much. Yeah. Yeah, and the dialogue, that's a perfect way, is that it's not going to be the same in every cultural context, particularly with indigenous native peoples, the Native Americans, people in African traditions, original peoples in Australia. There's such an imbalance between the dominant group and then the oppressed group that it has to come out in different ways, and people often, as you say, shift back and forth between multiple meanings of the symbols. Even the statue of the Virgin Mary, as in Guadalupe, can be the mother and Mary, both. And you see it with both eyes open. Thank you.
Yes, Bob here.
Father Clooney, at least in the U.S. press, at least I get a sense of a very politically militant, aggressive version of Hinduism in the public debate currently in India. Two parts, I guess, of that. Do you find that consistent with the traditional Hindu principles that you've studied? And second, can you be reconciled to that as a Catholic and as a priest?
So I think you open up a very important area of discussion that, most of what I said, except for my contemporary issues in Kathmandu and then in Madras in the south, is dealing with ideal classical materials and mystical poetry and so on. But like this country, like Israel, Palestine, like Catholic countries or formerly Catholic countries in Europe, Buddhist countries in Southeast Asia, culture moves on, politics complicate everything, and India is no exception. And I'm glad you asked that, because it would be definitely misleading, to fall back into the idea of Shangri-La, the mystical East, where nothing has changed. And I think as in Islam and Christianity too, there's a whole spectrum of Hindu positions toward the state. It's only 75 years after 1,000 years of non-Hindu rule in the subcontinent. And I think you could say that India, which is now probably the largest population in the world, I think it's surpassed China, is trying to figure out how to be itself. I think this could go on for hours, but I'll try to be just brief, and we could talk later if you want. But there are some grounds in Hindu text and Hindu tradition, even epics like Ramayana, Mahabharata, for a more militant form of Hinduism, defending the faith, fighting back against what is not Dharma, not being afraid to use the sword. And so it would be unfair to say that the more right-of-center Hindu groups in India are betraying Hinduism or something, because the spectrum is such. But I would say that my experience is, and obviously I have no proof statistically, is that the vast majority of Hindu people, both in India and the West, still want to live in harmony and peace with their neighbor. And that there is a great disposition in Hindu traditions toward the many ways of seeing the face of God. And I think one of the great debates in India that's going to go on for the next generation or two probably will be about what kind of political structures will redefine India 100 years after independence. So I think there are things to worry about in terms of the rights of minorities and so on. But I think the Hindu tradition has the resources to right the balance and to be respectful of minorities and respectful of people's individual faith, as Christian, as Buddhist, as Muslim, and so on.
Thank you.
C.S. Lewis thought that Hindu was closer to Christianity than most other religions. Did you choose it, or was it just happenstance that you ended up where that was the culture?
Well, I mean, so when I was, again, in 1971, that conference, Go Global, Think Globally, as I mentioned, I thought of the Philippines, Caroline Islands, Nigeria. It's sort of, in a fairly simple, simplistic sense, Gandhi, Mother Teresa, India. And then I ended up in Kathmandu because of visa problems with India. And it was in Kathmandu. And many, many young people in those days, and even now, who go to Nepal are interested in Buddhism. And Buddhism is what jumps out at them in the culture, and particularly the Tibetan Buddhism, the Dalai Lama's tradition, and so on. But for me, I have great respect for Buddhism, but it didn't resonate with me at all the way the Hindu traditions did. And so I think right from the start, I found that the Hindu traditions, the temples, the worship, the smells and bells, the colors, the individual, the saints, all resonated with me well. And that's why I referred at one moment to growing up Irish Catholic, New York, pre-Vatican II, benediction, Latin Mass, flowers and bells. Hindu and Catholic have some of the same. I was at a conference sponsored by Notre Dame in Rome it was before COVID, maybe about 5 years ago. And on the last day of the conference, they took us to St. Peter's for a tour. And there were 2 Hindus in the group, and they absolutely loved being in St. Peter's. And they didn't want to leave because they said, look, all the statues and all the painting, and there's one priest saying Mass there, and there's another priest saying there, and there's 2 popes buried over there. And it was just like marveling at it, saying, we feel so much at home in this space. And I think I've instinctively felt at home in the temples.
Well, I had a dear friend, Hindu, and we used to go to the Catholic Church where her daughter was cantor. And she would go up and take communion, and she would say, come ahead. And I of course, I would not, because I had been cultured differently. But I also went to India with her and to a family wedding. And so when you talked about having friends, of course it's only one tiny experience, but still it's a very beautiful thing.
But having a tiny experience is an excellent starting point. I mean, it's an experience you can let it grow, like the mustard seed that grows.
Right.
And it gives you a new disposition.
Well, it was before I discovered the traditions of the Anglican Church with liturgy.
Yeah.
And so she would take me to Diwali festivals and other places. And I really haven't traced my path exactly, but as I think about it now, that was probably part of my passage to falling in love with
I mean, my experience is that,
the
we can talk
liturgy.
about this, learning from another religious tradition can help you to rediscover your own tradition. And I know people who've, through the study of Hinduism or Buddhism, suddenly realized there's a mystical spiritual tradition to Christianity. And they had no idea, but they suddenly are sent back. You may know the story Thomas Merton, Seven-Story Mountain, his great story. At one point in there, he's in New York, he's Columbia, trying to find his way religiously, spiritually, and a Hindu monk comes through town, Brahmachari. And Brahmachari is apparently a little guy, wears red sneakers and orange robes, And he's talking, and Merton asks him, "What shall I do, Swami? What shall I do with my life?" And the Swami says to him, "You should read Thomas à Kempis, The Imitation of Christ. You should read John of the Cross. You should read Augustine's Confessions." And Merton, like, you know, in writing about this years later, says, it was almost as if God sent that Hindu monk all the way from India to New York to tell me, "Merton, learn your own tradition." And he was always thankful that this monk didn't say, "Oh, read the Upanishads." He said, "No, read Thomas à Kempis, Imitation of Christ."
In your wonderful experiences in relative religion and comparing traditions, figures, what have you been able to make of the unique sort of claims we make in our Christian tradition for the person of Jesus? There are so many things we compare and find similar. What sense would you make in comparison with the Hindu faith of this person, Jesus?
Yeah. So now we're getting to some pretty basic questions. Who do you say that I am? And I think, I mean, for me, I think what learning from Hinduism has done for me is clear away a lot of the baggage of things that we thought were unique and weren't unique. So, you know, Christian culture, mysticism, the idea of grace, a personal God, life after death, God loves you. A lot of this we said, well, that's all that is Christian. Only we know those things, and we're not the only ones who know those things. But the point of it is then to say that, well, then there's really nothing left, and therefore all religions are the same, or, you know, take your pick. Because I think my sense is, and again, you go back to the Gospel of John, is that the core of Christianity is this intimate companionship with Jesus. Like the blind man in chapter 9, you suddenly you know who he is and you prostrate yourself before him. At the end of chapter 6 of John, I alluded to this yesterday, everybody leaves because Jesus says, "Eat my flesh, drink my blood." And he says to the apostles, "Are you going to go away too?" And Peter says, "To whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life." So I think it's quite, for me, I don't mean to say, take your pick, Christ, Krishna, Buddha, and so on, or the intimate core that makes somebody be a believing Christian, willing to die for their faith, evaporates because you're a comparativist now. But rather that it's sort of purified and says it's about Jesus, and then everything else follows from that. But I think my point is that that intimate companionship with Jesus, or surrender to Jesus, should today be religiously, interreligiously literate, where we don't confuse our claims about Jesus with all kinds of preposterous claims about Christendom or Christianity. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah. Yeah, we could talk afterwards. Yeah, and I think some of the people, Bruce had, people have had, books have been written on the uniqueness of Christ. Is there salvation outside the church? Is there any other name by which you can be saved? And those are, I think, secondary questions, because the gut question is, who is Jesus for you? And then does being entirely for Jesus prevent you from having a Hindu friend or going to a Buddhist stupa or doing yoga? No, I don't think so. I mean, I think Jesus is far more open-minded than the defenders of Jesus.
If I may, I've held for a long time that when Jesus said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life," that's been interpreted in such narrow ways, in such exclusive ways, and I think not in spirit with his true
Yeah,
intent. I am the way, like I think he, if I could say what
Yeah.
I think he meant you have to approach the Godhead in just the way I have.
Yeah.
Spiritual
Yeah.
need, obedience, in the way, I am the way, my way
Yeah.
is, and what we see is that's pretty universal
Mm-hmm.
in spiritual life.
I had at the beginning that passage from Nostra Aetate, the church document on whatever is true and beautiful and holy. After that passage, there is saying, why? Because Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. Which you might think logically, because Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, none of these things are true or holy. But the document says, because Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, we're not afraid of the holy and the true. And I always took that to mean wherever there is truth, there is Christ. Wherever there is life, there is Christ. Wherever people are on the way, there is Christ. Don't be afraid. And don't, again, use Christ as a barrier, an excuse for not learning into religiously.
Well, I'm mindful of your time. Are you willing to take another
sure,
question
yeah.
from Bruce? Bruce, did you have a question?
Can go on all night. Yeah.
I was going to ask two. One is you've done some work with Thomas Merton. I don't know if you knew Merton or what.
I did not know Merton.
But I think what's your view of Thomas Merton and his work?
So he, as you know, tragically died when he was only 53 years old. So writes this powerful book, A 7-Story Mountain, about growing up vaguely secular, has a kind of uneven childhood. His parents, I think, maybe divorced. I'm not sure of that. Apparently has a child, fathers a child out of wedlock, and eventually is sent away from the scene in England and sent to Columbia to study, and begins there to have this literature professors, philosophy professors who begin to get Thomas Merton to ask himself who he is. And in that context, he begins to raise questions about what does it mean to be a human being? What are the values? So he finds his way to being a Christian, becomes a Roman Catholic, decides he wants to be a priest. The Franciscans tell him no, apparently, because he fathered a child out of wedlock. He doesn't like the Jesuits. He thinks the Jesuits are uppity. And so then he ends up in the Trappists. But the beautiful scenes, such as the one I said that, the Brahmachari, is that he has his personal journey, and apparently when the book was written, the manuscript publishers were doubtful, would anyone read this book by a man who became a Trappist monk? And I think it became the best-selling Catholic book of the 20th century, Roman Catholic book of the 20th century. And I think then it's remarkable that somehow in Gethsemane, where I've been there several times to Gethsemane, I mean, he opened up exploration and he engaged the culture from the monastic setting, the Vietnam War, race issues, other problems in American life. And he began to learn from Zen, learn from Sufis, study Hinduism. I have some tapes of him teaching yoga to the novices, not doing the positions, but talking about yoga to the novices. This recently finished was like an 8-volume collection of Merton on other religions. And so I think an amazing person who somehow went deep into contemplative Trappist tradition, and that opened things up. And he went to Thailand in 1968, his first trip as a monk outside the US. He went through India on the way there, what became the Asian Journal. And then there he talks about meeting the Dalai Lama and going to different temples. And then he has all sorts of notes about when he comes back, he's going to do this and do that, and when he's going to go to Japan and all that. But he goes to Bangkok, gives a talk, goes to his room, takes a shower, turns on the fan, electrocuted, and he's dead at 53. What would have happened to Merton? I've known Buddhists who said, well, he's already been reborn as a Tibetan monk. He's already back up there. But I think he was broadening the base of how do you be a Christian contemplative who's not afraid of interreligious learning. So I think he's still incredibly popular. My students read him all the time. Yeah.
Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
For those of you who enjoyed tonight's program, which I'm sure was everyone here, if I'm right, you have a memoir coming out covering a lot of the same material and obviously going into much more detail. Is that sometime later this year?
I'm working on it now. It's tentatively called, although the publisher didn't like the idea, called Hindu Catholic Priest Scholar: A Love Story. I think it's a good title, but my publisher, so I'm hoping, I promised the publisher I'd give it to the publisher by August.
Okay,
Maybe sooner. Therefore, it'll be out in 2024.
24, okay.
Yeah.
Well, when it is out, would you please share that with us so that I
Yes.
can distribute it to the
Okay.
community?
Okay.
And again, another thank you, round of
Yeah,
applause for
thank you.
Father Clooney. Let us go forth in the name of Christ. Thanks be to God.
Thanks be to God. Good. That was good. Good questions. Good discussion. Yes.
I just want to thank you. I come from a Christian tradition. I've been teaching yoga for a number of years.
Okay.
And I draw from yoga philosophy
Okay.
to introduce my classes. And of course, that's all Hindu and very
Do you follow a certain yoga path or a certain tradition?